Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to this Innovation Insights Research Seminar. My name is Becky Matz, and I'm a research scientist here at the Center for Academic Innovation. With this seminar series, CAI aims to bring together people who are trying to share their knowledge, improving learner success, and transforming education at lots of different levels. Today, I'm super excited that my colleague, Dr. Ben Motz, is here with us to share about his work and how we can do better educational research experiments in ways that lead to more generalizable outcomes. So instead of, like I was saying, as we were chatting before this, instead of saying like, this works with this group of 17 kids and this on Tuesdays in February, what are some ways that we can sort of enable better experimentation? So I'm particularly excited to hear this seminar. Ben is an assistant professor at Indiana's University Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences, and his research lies at the intersection of cognitive psychology and education, characterized by large-scale experiments and analyses on students from real educational settings that test theoretical predictions from the psychological science of learning. So thank you all for being with us here this afternoon, in particular to Ben, and I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to Ben.
Thank you so much, Becky. I really appreciate the invitation. Again, I feel a special kinship with you because our names are so similar.
Yes.
Nobody I know has such a close Levenstein distance. And it's such an honor to be sharing with Michigan here on this particular Monday. What the heck? So I was traveling over Thanksgiving break and we flew back on Saturday during the game. And I have a really kind of fraught relationship with football, but I have never seen a country come together like it came together on Saturday. Like so much celebration, just like jubilation around the country. Like this isn't just in Indiana. Just everybody was so excited for.
Yeah, one field goal can change the whole season. It's amazing.
It's amazing. Yep. And yeah, the feeling that there's hope too. Okay. So let me share my screen. My plan is to talk relatively fast so that we can leave time for questions at the end. I'm not gonna monitor chat, so feel free to raise your hand or something. Maybe there can be an interruption somehow through some mediated way if you have any immediate questions, but I'm excited to spend some time just chatting with you guys and hearing your thoughts after the talk. My name is Ben Motz. I'm from Indiana University. I'm in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. Let me tell you a little bit about me and what motivates me. On the one hand, I have a research program that aims to disrupt and replace basically what I'll call the conventional methods for finding evidence of relevant learning mechanisms in real-world settings. So I'm sharing this quote that I really like by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Knowing is not enough, we must apply. Willing is not enough, we must do. And basically what that's saying is that yeah, you could be doing a good job using naturalistic stimuli in laboratory settings, but because it's in laboratory settings, that's not quite enough. And it's also not quite enough to test your methods just in one single classroom. That's pushing the envelope. But if we want to test general causal mechanisms of learning, we should be running studies at grand scales across a diversity of learners and environments. So imagine this in another domain. If we want to determine a vaccine's real-world efficacy, you shouldn't just accept study that's conducted on human-like models or conducted at only a single clinic. And I believe the same should apply to claims about learning mechanisms. But I also want to say that I don't think that theory right now is the bee's knees. And I'm personally bothered by situations where theoretical predictions don't play out in practice. And as my colleague, Kara Lewis, famously said to me, I'm motivated by what bothers me, and that applies to me too. I don't see theory to practice as this one-way street where we just translate from theory to practice. I believe that learning theory has a lot to gain from practice, a lot of room for maturation. So my work's been motivated by the view that our theory about how people learn could become much more robust by incorporating real-world influences. So let's just put you on the spot. Let's imagine that you're a thoughtful and reflective teacher who's interested in the science of learning. At tremendous hardship, you manage to get IRB approval, or maybe a remote school's approval, and you spend months of your life implementing an experiment into that learning context. And then students at the end of the semester, at the term or something, finally take the ultimate outcome assessment. You're practically sweating with enthusiasm to analyze the data. And when you finally do, you look at the results and you find that you've failed to observe the expected effect. So what do? Well, first you'll cry, and I think that that's an appropriate response. But then, if it's any comfort at all, you remember this presentation here by Ben Motz, and you remember this one thing that Ben is about to say, and that's, you are not alone. I'll share two studies with you. So first on the left here is a study by Regan Gurung and Kathleen Burns in 2018, where they took retrieval practice, which they believe to be maybe one of the most robust, possibly robust principles of from the science of learning that could apply to educational contexts, and tried to see if they could actually put it to the test. They took 8 nearly identical introductory psychology classes with about 500 students. 4 classes encouraged students to practice retrieval on their homework quizzes, and 4 classes didn't. They just said, hey, do the homeworks, but don't go back and do them again. And they found, paradoxically, that students who took the quizzes multiple times had lower exam grades and course grades than the students who took the quizzes only once. So here's a situation where they definitely failed to observe the expected effect. And if I was just going to do a little review of all the most important from the science of learning, practices for improving student learning, the next one would be spacing. Here's a study just last year, or just this year. So from Campbell Bago and Keith Lyle and colleagues, where they took 9 introductory STEM classes at one institution, so this time almost 600 students. And they found that what they did was they randomly assigned students to either master spaced practice for different concepts. So then they measured how students' performance was on those concepts depending on whether they were master spaced. And they found basically that there was marginally improved performance for spaced concepts only in 2 of these classes. And there was negative but not significant effects of spacing observed in 2 classes. So basically it was a giant wash. And again, the thing that the science of learning from theory had suggested would be wildly beneficial in practice turned out to not even work. So I want to highlight a couple things about these failed replication attempts. So first, the authors of these research studies are highly experienced at conducting embedded experiments in authentic student learning settings. It wasn't just like they were inexperienced or didn't know what they were doing or doing things uncarefully. And second, these effects, retrieval practice and spacing, are putatively the most robust and reliable study interventions that cognitive psychology could possibly offer education. But it's not just these two. I want to also say that there's been studies of replication attempts more broadly in education, and basically half of published replication studies fail to find support that's consistent with the original studies. And things are even worse for IES-funded scale-up intervention studies, where they found that only about 1/3 of IES-funded replications observe effects that are consistent with the original finding. So what do we do when results from a research study conflict with theory? Well, there's at least 3 possibilities. One of them is that everything worked right, that maybe theory is wrong. You had a valid measure in that class that you did things on, and theory just didn't pan out because that mechanism doesn't exist. So it could be that theory is wrong. Another possibility is experimenters regress. Experimenters regress is the observation that in order to judge whether evidence is erroneous, we kind of have to rely on theory. But in order to judge the correctness of theory, we have to rely on evidence. So if you accept that this is a problem, basically that we could distrust our own findings, then field research can only ever confirm theory. It can't refute theory, and we can never distinguish between A and B, which is a problem because then we don't know what to do with field tests if they're not, if they don't agree with what we thought we would observe. Now, alternatively, it's possible that the results are just totally idiosyncratic to some unique feature of the classroom where the experiment was conducted. Like Becky said, maybe just Tuesdays in February. But this is something that everybody's known, that maybe it's the case that the mechanism that we're trying to observe is an interaction with context. So whenever we measure an outcome, we're only ever really observing some interaction effect. And it's hard to parse out whether it's the effect of the mechanism or the effect of context. And this isn't just an isolated issue that occurs for unlucky researchers. If anything, this is the norm in classroom experimentation. I talk with people who've done research like this in classrooms and say, hey, have you ever done a study that found basically null effects when you needed to find an effect to support theory? And basically, that's a universal. So it's not just something that researchers experience. It's not just something that researchers talk about. It's also the case that funders are aware of this. I have this quote here from the past director of IES, Mark Schneider, who in 2018, in one of his early blog posts, he wrote, A central goal of the mission of IES is to identify what works for whom, under what conditions. Unfortunately, most of the studies that have found impact contribute little to helping us meet that goal. Many, if not the great majority of these projects were carried out in a single location and or tested with a relatively small number of settings, teachers, and learners. Given the limited scope of these projects, it's usually impossible to judge whether the tested interventions would work with different types of students or in different education venues. So for years, the IES has funded both replications and scale-up studies, where an intervention that previously showed impact at local scale is extended to new settings. And again, according to IES's own analyses, only about a third of these replication findings find evidence that's consistent with their original research. So people do things in small scales. You might think that, okay, we're talking about the Center for Academic Innovation. I'm really interested in technology. Maybe with technology, things will just magically change. And the answer is probably not. So in learning analytics, looking at specifically data from post-pandemic learning analytics, so after this great boom in online education, we did a review, including some awesome people from Michigan, of basically all the published articles in the Journal of Learning Analytics and Learning Analytics and Knowledge, the conference, and found that overall, in this relatively recent sample, the median sample size of studies conducted using technology and learning analytics was 283 students, which was basically just one course. And 77% of the research articles that report class level data at all sample from five or fewer courses. So basically those studies that are trying to describe the sample at the level of the class have just a handful of possible classes to be able to describe that heterogeneity. So it's not like people are leveraging just kind of out of the kindness of their hearts or a will to go to scale. They're not leveraging the technology that's available to them to be able to do that. This is something that also plays out in more traditional education research spheres. So it's been said many times over in lots of different ways that experimentation in education is just too expensive and difficult to be able to conduct. So maybe people collapse onto just doing it in their own class. And even so, it's usually really hard. So I like this quote from Joel Levin in 2005. He said, "The requisite resources are generally far in excess of what most education researchers could hope to amass in the absence of considerable extramural funding. So consequently, researchers tend to conduct more manageable, less ambitious, and typically less carefully controlled classroom studies." There's a more recent, in 2017, review of what prevents faculty from engaging in this case, it was like SOTL. And basically half of all STEM faculty found that it was insufficient assessment methods and processes, basically methodological barriers to STEM reform. This is the case that being able to measure whether something works is a bigger barrier than the resources required for that innovation or even confidence that the practices will work. So it's really a big problem that we have trouble measuring whether something's going to work actually in our classes. The last sort of piece of depressing news that I give you before I start talking about possible solutions is that these difficulties actually play out in the literature. So the proportion of educational psychology studies with random assignment, like experiments that are trying to detect causal impact, is basically unchanged since 1996. And for what it's worth, this is during a time between 1996 and 2020 when experimental methods have dramatically increased in other research domains. Like even philosophy is experiencing a surge in experimental philosophy, and so is linguistics, and so is cybersecurity. So it's the case that in education, something is fundamentally broken. It's really the case that people are kind of stuck in an old way of doing things and failing to be able to capitalize on the scale that's made possible by technology. So if we actually want to understand what works for whom under what conditions, we actually need to do two things. So first, we need to overcome the difficulties of running experiments in our classes. And second, we need to be running these experiments at broader scales. So if I can, this is kind of my thesis. It's worth saying I'm not the only one who said this. So as early as 2008, in a commentary in response to Slavin, who levied a bunch of interesting criticisms of education research, Briggs wrote, "The apparent ideal would then be to have a collection of randomized experiments with considerable heterogeneity. So not just trying something in one class or in two classes that are homogeneous, but in a heterogeneous sample of classes among students and treatments and outcomes. However, there are very few of these studies available." So to summarize all of the things that I've been saying so far, experimental research on classroom learning is practically always conducted on just one class. And when you do it that way, It's unclear what to do with negative findings. If you find something, if you're lucky enough to find something, it's unclear whether the results would generalize to new classes. And it's also unclear why you observed the results. You can't say that it's because of a mechanism, because it could be specific to the unique context where you embedded the study. And if these are the problems that make it really hard, that make people like the director of IES suggest that education research is broken, then it should be pretty clear what the solution is. Instead of conducting research on just one class, we should do it on many classes. And that's the core idea behind the ManyClasses project. The first ManyClasses study was published in 2021, and it investigated how the timing of feedback affects students' learning. We chose timing of feedback, specifically whether it's immediate or delayed by a day or so. We chose timing of feedback because feedback is universal in classroom settings, and also because there was a pretty easy way of implementing this experiment in the technology that existed, which is Canvas. ManyClasses 1 really emphasized that thing that Briggs emphasized, and that's that things should be heterogeneous. So we didn't tell teachers what the study materials would be. We used teachers' own materials and allowed teachers to determine many aspects of the study implementation, so that we weren't just measuring a fixed implementation of feedback timing. Instead, we were measuring a diversity of classes where it wasn't actually representative of the country, but at least it was representative of a much broader range of possible implementations than what would be characteristic of experiments. The first ManyClasses study had 38 classes total across 15 college campuses and 5 institutions, including Michigan. These were all Unison institutions, so Unison made a lot of the features of ManyClasses a lot easier, like data collection. Total student enrollment in this study was almost 3,000 students, so 2,917. There was about an average of 75 students per class. And of that sample, we had roughly 80% consent rate. So it's worth saying, I'll mention this a few times, we don't just assume that teachers should go and experiment on students. we actually like to be transparent about it. So we collected consent, and only students who had provided consent we do these analyses on. So students should know that the experiment is happening. These kinds of research studies, I mean, I'm presenting it, but I want to make clear that it's not just like a Ben Motz effort. So the list of contributing authors and the acknowledgements were pretty long. For people to actually scale, it's not going to be the case that there's one champion that goes off and scales and then everybody celebrates that champion. It's instead going to be a collaborative effort. So I really want to give credit to University of Michigan to signing up and saying like, yeah, we'll give it a shot. And also the other institutions that were interested to be able to collaborate. So to be able to scale and to do these things right, you kind of need a collaborative effort. Kudos to Michigan. This is how it actually looks in Canvas. So if we were to manipulate the timing of feedback, imagine a student submitting a weekly homework quiz that has multiple choice questions, so it can be auto-graded. If you've delayed feedback, then a student would see the screen on the left. So basically, upon clicking the Submit Quiz button, they would then see the screen on the left that says, the quiz has been muted, so you'll have to wait until some later time when the instructor finishes grading the quiz to be able to see your scores. And we randomize students to either see this or to receive immediate feedback. And so that when they clicked Submit Quiz, they would see the results right away. So they would see that attempt and what their score was. And depending on the teacher's feelings, then maybe they would be able to go back and actually see what the correct answers are and everything. And it's worth saying there are perfectly good reasons for a teacher to choose either of these, having nothing to do with the research study. In fact, many teachers, even using auto-grading, will oftentimes delay students receiving feedback. And the reason for that is to prevent students from knowing their scores while other students are taking the test. So it wasn't the case that we were doing something wild and weird by having the feedback be delayed. It's instead the case that this is a theoretical question, whether feedback should be sent immediately or delayed by a few days, that actually the research community is not in consensus on. And here we're trying to measure the outcome across a large, diverse sample of classes. Here's the study design in fancy colors. Again, the ManyClasses 1 study had 38 classes, and we did something interesting where at the class level, an entire class was assigned to what I'll call an incentive condition. You can imagine that with feedback being the manipulation, there's a potential issue where students might not look at the feedback at all. So at the class level, some of these classes randomly were assigned to an incentive condition where teachers incentivized the students to look at the feedback. Oftentimes, this was in the form of a small follow-up assignment where it asks students a reflection question about the feedback that they received. So maybe it would say something like, which of the questions that you got wrong do you think was the hardest question or something? So it really would have required students to go back and see the feedback, or a class didn't have any incentive like that, and it was just kind of like natural to find out whether the student would go back and look at their feedback. Again, all of the students provided consent. That was encrypted from the instructor, so instructors didn't know which students were participating or not. And we did what I'll call a within-subject crossover design. So every student got delayed feedback on one homework assignment and got immediate feedback on another homework assignment. So in the incentive condition, if you got delayed first, then you get immediate. If you got immediate first, then you get delayed. And we had outcome measures that measured student learning from material that was delayed and material that where the feedback was immediate. And then afterward, we collected all these pooled data. We did moderator analyses and heterogeneity analyses. And all of it was Bayesian. It was an analytical party. I'm going to show the results in a forest plot. I don't know how familiar people are with forest plots, so let me just give you a kind of a rough orientation. On the left, we've got all these different course IDs, 1 to 38. And in what I'm going to do is I'm going to plot a course's outcomes. So basically a course's outcome as a point with a credible interval around it that tells you basically at the level of that course whether immediate feedback is better or delayed feedback is better. So if immediate feedback is better in course 31, then you'd expect a dot over here that has a credible interval that doesn't overlap 0. And here it's in the no incentive condition, so I've labeled it in red. If we could also observe results like this, where maybe a course tends to have better outcomes when feedback was immediate, but it's overlapping 0, so it's relatively uncertain, and we would need more data to be able to understand whether that's a credible effect for that course. It could like strongly overlap 0, and again, some of these classes will be blue, meaning that they're in the incentive condition, or it could go in the other direction. So that's how forest plots work, but this isn't the real data. Let me show you the actual data. Drum roll, please. Okay, so here's the 38 classes, and something that should be pretty abundantly all of a sudden clear is that all of them really closely overlap 0, such that the overall effect, if we combine all these classes, is almost perfectly centered on 0. And I want to say something else about this. We did heterogeneity analyses. So it's not the case that there's like a whole bunch of uncertainty and we just don't know. Instead, it's the case that no, across all these classes, there's remarkable certainty that there's no overall generalizable difference in learning performance when students receive immediate feedback compared with delayed feedback. So there's no global effect at all. We could argue for infinity about whether immediate feedback is better or delayed feedback is better. And basically what we're finding out is that there is no single answer to that question. Again, you might be wondering, well, okay, look at these. Some of these classes tended to have better benefits for immediate feedback. Others tended to have some benefit for delayed feedback. Is there any difference between the classes or between the students that might explain some of these differences? Like, are there any moderator analyses? We did a whole bunch of moderator analyses and basically found no strong evidence of systematic differences in the effects of feedback timing between students or classes. Like literally across all of these ways of trying to find systematic differences between classes. This is the class level, this is the level of the individual exam, the level of the institution, the quiz, the student. Almost all of these estimates pretty clearly overlap 0. That caused us to be concerned, like maybe we're observing just noise. So we decided to zoom in on just a few moderator effects that we thought had some theoretical value, and also we should see some effect if there is any that might be detectable, even if it's not significant. So we looked at the number of treatment quizzes. This is basically the amount of data that we collect from each class. We also looked at the delay length. This is something like the treatment dosage. And we also looked at the percentage of retrieval-based items, because there's stuff out there in the literature that suggests that multiple choice questions might have slightly less of an effect of getting feedback than open-ended questions. And these are the results for these moderator analyses. I'm sorry that it looks so visually confusing, but bear with me. On the x-axis for each of these is the moderator. So in the left graph, it's the number of treatment quizzes. In the middle, it's the dosage, so the days between due date and delayed feedback. This is like how delayed is the feedback. And then on the right is the proportion of retrieval-based exam items. And you can kind of see that there are trends. Like in this case, the red lines tend to have kind of like this slope from upper left to bottom right, and the blue lines seem to have a slope from bottom left to upper right, but they also overlap zero. So I'll call all of these trends that you see here directional. And in total, they suggest that if I increase the dosage of feedback, like make the delay longer, and also increase the number of quizzes, then maybe delaying feedback seems to start having a benefit, particularly when viewing feedback is incentivized and the tests are retrieval based. But it's also worth pointing out something about these results. If you kind of look on the right side of the graph, so even though we had 38 classes, there were only 3 classes that had legitimately weekly treatment quizzes. And over here, there were only 3 classes that had 5 days of delay. And over here, there were very few classes that had 100% retrieval-based quizzes. So it was the case that most of the quizzes were something else. They were like where most of the items on, I'm sorry, not on the quizzes, on the outcomes, most of the items were all multiple choice. So we get kind of have sparse coverage in the regions that would help us show moderator effects in this particular study. So let me give you some takeaways from ManyClasses 1. I'll start by saying that large-scale distributed experimentation in online settings is feasible because there's institutions like IU in Michigan that are willing to let random researchers go in and play around with students with their consent and with really strong protections for student privacy. So it's possible to be able to scale up. And it's also possible to design with variation in mind. So it's not the case that we need to enforce every detail of the study. We can let some things vary according to what teachers' preferences are. But this wasn't a perfect study by any means. So one problem that I think that, I don't know, we could debate whether it's a problem, but it would have been nice if we had found an effect. So the fact that we've observed moderator effects that are kind of directional, but they're not real, suggests that we need even bigger samples. So if we're actually going to be able to succeed at demonstrating effects at scale, then 38 classes might not be enough to be able to do that. And another thing that I haven't mentioned about ManyClasses 1 is that it took 3 years. And 36 months to be able to run a study is totally not sustainable, especially not if you're like a pre-tenure professor. So you can't spend 3 years running a study and expect that to be the sort of thing that would be good enough to sustain a research career. So we need to find ways to get around these particular obstacles. So also, the way that we can get around these obstacles, I think, is that we can develop research infrastructure. So in every other domain of inquiry, like look at astronomy, there's research infrastructure that researchers share. Like we don't expect astronomers to make their own telescope. We expect them to share a telescope. Same with like electron scanning microscopes. Just about every infrastructure is something that we wouldn't expect an individual researcher to need to prepare, except in education. So there's just a dearth of shared infrastructure in education, and we need better research infrastructure if we're going to be able to scale. So let me change topics in this talk, and instead of talking about studies that don't have infrastructure, introduce you to some research infrastructure that we've been working on ever since the first ManyClasses study. So I run Terracotta. Terracotta is a weird, like, acronym portmanteau thing for Tool for Educational Research with Randomized Control Trials. There's this website, terracotta.education. It's been supported well by the Institute of Education Sciences and also by Schmidt Futures. It's part of a network that IES has funded called SeerNet. So it's not the only experimental research infrastructure that's out there. And we're putting Terracotta together in direct collaboration with Canvas and with Unicon, which is one of the most pioneering software development agencies in education. And it's also a service of IU. And what Terracotta is it's a plugin to the Canvas learning management system that basically makes it possible to do an experiment in that class course site. So it basically makes the process of setting up a ManyClasses study, as long as everybody's using Canvas, much easier. For example, the core foundational aspect of an experiment is random assignment. So to maintain a study's integrity and minimize bias, you can name conditions, and then students would be randomly assigned to these different conditions that would determine later treatments. If you've ever tried to run an experiment in Canvas before, you'll know that this is like a giant obstacle. You can create sections, and that might get some of the problem solved, but groups don't involve differentiation, and differentiating things is just a general difficulty. So Terracotta does that part. As I mentioned, consent, I think, is an important cornerstone of experimental research that we should maintain, especially in education settings. And Terracotta weaves informed consent into the process of experiment creation. It stores participants' decisions and assigns them to experimental treatments accordingly. If somebody doesn't agree to participate, then they don't get randomly assigned. They'll get whatever the teacher decides is a default treatment. And yeah, the fun thing about this is that it presents as an assignment in Canvas, but it's a unique assignment where the teacher can never see how a student responded. They can only see that a student responded. So a teacher could give students credit for submitting an informed consent assignment, but they never know what the answer is. They only know that the student rendered a decision. And Terracotta also supports within subject crossover designs, like what we did for ManyClasses 1, where all students get all treatments just at different times. And I think this is important because what it does is it eliminates the potential criticism of an experimental research study. Let's imagine that we're testing the difference between treatment A and treatment B. If A is better than B, then a potential concern would be, well, what do you do about the students who got B? And a way of addressing that concern, if B is inferior, is to say, no, everybody's going to get all treatments just at different times. So this might also be thought of as a delayed treatment design. And that eliminates the possibility of bias due to experimental treatment because, again, all students get all experiences. If you've ever set up an experiment that uses crossover designs, you'll know this is hard. So it's pretty spectacular that Terracotta totally automates it. Terracotta also does this neat thing that's otherwise challenging and that constituted a giant part of the difficulty and the time that it took to do ManyClasses 1, and that's that it directly links an experimental assignment to a gradebook item. So you could say, okay, I've done an experiment, and what I want to do now is measure students' scores on the midterm, and then it automatically brings in the midterm scores only for consenting students into the research data export. So you can determine if your assignment intervention had real impact outside the scope of the experiment on your natural assessments. And also, if you're looking at this, you can't see it, but imagine me like scrolling up a little bit. Oh, sorry, scrolling up a little bit right here. There's this neat blue button at the top of the status screen that's not visible here that says export data. And if you click on that export data button, you're given a zip archive that contains all of the data from the experiment. So it doesn't have any identifiers, so you only see Terracotta internal participant IDs, but you see for those participants what their responses are on the manipulated assignments, when they responded, when they consented, and you also see the exam scores that you've brought in. If you didn't have this work that Terracotta was doing on the back end, it would be a wildly arduous task. So Terracotta does it automatically, and we also provide a data dictionary and some example R scripts to be able to make it easier for people to figure stuff out. So that's the end of my quasi-sales pitch for Terracotta. Yeah, if you're ever interested to learn more about it, you can find out more at terracotta.education. I want to turn from the fact that it exists to asking the question, now what? So we've built research infrastructure. What do we do? And at the same time that Terracotta was coming online, this bright opportunity opened up. So XPRIZE, which runs like grown-up science fairs, so research competitions, came out with the Digital Learning Challenge. And we decided to throw Terracotta into the ring to try and see whether we could win this grown-up science fair using Terracotta. And the goal of the XPRIZE Digital Learning Challenge was to enable experiments in education, a frequency, scope, and scale not currently possible through traditional methods used in education research or commercial ed tech processes for that matter. So basically, winning team would need to conduct an RCT using any meaningful and substantive educational intervention, like a classroom assignment, and wouldn't just do it once. It would need to be systematically replicated at least 5 times in no more than 30 days. That experiment wouldn't just be in a homogeneous group, it would need to be in a heterogeneous group, so using at least 3 different distinct demographics as designed by the research team. And everything would need to be pre-registered and totally open. So the XPRIZE Digital Learning Challenge extended from May 2021 to April 2023 to give away the outcome. We came in second, we tied with Carnegie Learning. The first place was this AI thing. And it's neat, but yeah, 2023 was definitely the year of AI. So we came in second, and I'm delighted that we tied with Carnegie Learning. And the question that we were basically trying to address with this is, could we run a many classes style study in just the 6 months when the demonstration phase was open using Terracotta? And really, we only had like 30 days to do it within that demonstration period. So yeah, the other parts of it were like collecting the data and making it so that it was analyzed within the 6 months. Again, by contrast, the first many classes study took 3 years. So this would be a dramatic acceleration if we were able to succeed. So what was the research study that we did? Well, we examined pre-questions. So to tell you more about pre-questions, I'll start by saying that in an education setting, questions can have different purposes. One purpose would be to evaluate whether students know something, but another thing that you might already be aware of is that you could use questions to actually help with the formation of knowledge. Pre-questions are one of these kind of latter things, and they're interesting because you ask a question before you've given students instructions. So imagine like sitting down in a class and starting with a little quiz where you don't know the answer to any of the questions because it's the start of class, and then the lecturer or instructor goes and explains what the content is. So you are given basically a test before you learn rather than a test after you learn. This has been studied for a long time. So almost 100 years ago, Washburn wrote, "The grouping of all questions at the beginning of the story is the best placement when looking at adjunct questions." So asking students questions before they read something as opposed to after was particularly effective in a study. And more recent researchers have suggested that maybe the pre-question effect is even greater than the testing effect. So this is an effect, again, saying that maybe asking pre-questions is more effective than retrieval practice after the fact. But we have no idea why pre-questions help. There's a ton of possibilities out there that people have hypothesized. One is that maybe it demonstrates knowledge gaps to the students. Maybe it activates a relevant mental model. Maybe it helps with error processing. So knowing that you're wrong might cause you to do something differently in class. Maybe it increases attention to the learning materials, or maybe it's a general priming effect. So ManyClasses 2 was designed to use Terracotta to be able to conduct a study on pre-questions in a diversity of classes in a very short amount of time. And the design looked kind of similar to ManyClasses 1. So because we had such an accelerated time scale and because there was a bunch of integration stuff, we weren't able to get up to 38 classes. We only had 26 classes in the sample. Again, every student provided informed consent. And the consent, if you consented, then you were randomly assigned to get pre-questions prior to watching a video that the teacher created, or no pre-questions. You're just shown the video that the teacher created, and there's an assessment on the material in that video. And then everybody switches, again, a crossover design, so that the next thing would be the opposite treatment. So if you saw no pre-questions, then you saw pre-questions. If you previously saw pre-questions, then you saw just the video. Some important notes about this design. This is kind of general pre-question research terms. So nobody got any feedback or points on the pre-questions, so we don't expect that students know the answer when they haven't received instruction yet. So we can't give points to that, and students didn't get any feedback other than the opportunity to watch the video. The test questions were identical or near identical to the pre-questions. Students had to answer the pre-questions to advance to the video, so it wasn't the case that like we said, okay, here's the questions, and then students could skip it. They actually had to respond. And to receive credit for this assignment that had the video, students had to mark a confirmation that they've watched the video. This is what it would have looked like, for example. So here's my colleague Emily Fife's video. So she made a video for her developmental psychology class that was on children's knowledge of the equal sign, and then another video that was on basically like gestures. So like when students are learning, when children are learning how their spontaneous co-speech hand gestures indicate something about their conceptual knowledge. And if you were a student in this class, in one condition, you would just jump straight to this video and you wouldn't see the questions, or you'd be randomly assigned to see the questions prior to the video. And then if you were in the pre-question condition, then you would not be in the pre-question condition for the next video. And then all the questions for both videos were included in the subsequent quiz. So you might be curious to learn more about the sample. So I mentioned that there were about 30 classes. Here is the list of them. So there were 4 schools that participated. So IU Bloomington was one, and University of Florida, and University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And to our delight, we managed to get Terracotta embedded in a school district just outside of Pittsburgh. So South Fayette School District also participated. So we had an amazing range of students. Like this is 6th grade Spanish up to like senior level college, veterinary medicine, and microbiology. So the content ranged dramatically. Students' accuracy on the pre-questions was greater than chance. So for the most part, these were multiple choice questions that had, I don't know, 1 correct answer out of 4. So you'd expect chance would be 25%. So there is some situations where students have a lot of background knowledge, like maybe in business collaboration, it might already be clear how to collaborate effectively. But other classes like Spanish, where you might just not know the vocabulary, then reasonable distractors might actually bias students away from the correct answer. All in all, we had about 3,000 students who were enrolled in these classes, and about 1,500 students ultimately consented. Here's our results. So unlike the first ManyClasses study, which found no difference between delayed and immediate feedback, here we're delighted that we actually find a robust and reliable effect of pre-questions for students' performance on those downstream learning effects. So here are the forest plots where we actually estimate the benefit of pre-testing for later performance. And this uses a hierarchical model with shrinkage toward the global estimate. So the plots are a little bit asymmetrical due to that hierarchical structure. But overall, we find a roughly 5% improvement in delayed test performance on content that's previously been pre-tested. And in all classes individually, this effect is positive. So the modal estimate of pre-questions is positive. And all the institutions in our sample also showed similar effects to each other. We also did some interesting moderator analyses. So we basically found also the case that there were differences that moderated this effect significantly. One of those was average percent correct on exam items. So basically, we find that you get a bigger boost for pre-questions on easy content. Or kind of in a similar vein, you also see bigger effects of pre-questions for students who have some prior knowledge. So basically, if they have a higher pretest score or higher pre-question score, those both indicate that students would get more out of it. But perhaps the more interesting question is, what happens when students are watching the videos? So one of the neat things about embedding this experiment in technology is we don't just have to assume that students watch the video. Terracotta was instrumented so that when students saw the embedded media player in Canvas, it actually recorded whether they started or stopped the video. For this, it turns out there's really 2 fascinating stories to tell about the results. So even while 90% of students confirmed that they'd watched the video, that said that they clicked the button, only about half of students watched any video in its entirety. So in fact, students overall watched less of the videos after they were exposed to pretest. So what you see here is that the likelihood that students will not start the video is basically increasing by 5%. But additional findings, analysis finds that this is primarily caused by a split in how individual students behave. So for these students on the bottom down here, it's not as if they're getting the pre-questions correct and then skipping ahead. It's actually the case that their performance on the pretest is lower than the students who do start the video. So there's no difference in their later performance in the late assessment between pre-tested and not pre-tested material. It's just the case that they decide to not start the video and then they get no benefit from having gotten pre-questions basically less right. So, but for the students who are at the top who do start the video after the pretest, that's where we see significant benefits of pretesting. So it's still significant overall across the whole sample because again, most students start the video. But again, most students who watch at least some of the video, most students will watch at least some of the video after the pretest. It's just that students who actually go on to watch the video are the ones who are driving the overall effect of pre-questions. So I'm sorry I have to talk through that so quickly, but the big takeaways from ManyClasses too is that to be able to do studies like this, research infrastructure is really key. And also, it's not the case that we're building research infrastructure and then not seeing the effects that are there. So learning interventions can generalize across dissimilar classes. It's not the case that everything just depends. So we see a main effect of pre-questions. We see that this effect is non-homogeneous. So as I mentioned before, the effect tends to be stronger in classes where the questions are easier, and it tends to be stronger among students who have prior knowledge. We could call this a rich get richer effect, which is an interesting pattern that we could talk about that sometimes is observed with education interventions. And also we see a treatment by behavior interaction. So it's the case that students' behavior after the treatment moderates their performance on later on later outcome assessments. So do we want research to generalize? I think the answer is yes. And if so, then few small nets are going to create problems. If theory is wrong, we won't know whether it's wrong by doing research at small scales. We really need, if we want to be able to test the benefits of theory, it's across education settings, we really need to be able to cast wider nets. And I suggest that doing it ManyClasses style is the way to go. And also, this effort benefits from infrastructure. Terracotta just makes it feasible. And with that, I want to say many thanks. This study wouldn't have been possible without the contributions of Anna Keeney and Harmony Jankowski, and also my co-leads on ManyClasses, Emily Fife and Josh DeLay. So thank you very much. I'm interested in any questions you have.
Yeah, Ben, thank you so much. If folks are thinking about something, feel free to put it in the chat or just unmute and go ahead and ask away. I have about 10 minutes to chit chat.
I'll ask a question. Thank you so much for this. This was fantastic. I'm so appreciative of the conversation. When you look at that rate of participation in ManyClasses to like 44% of students opting in, are you seeing systematic patterns in who isn't participating?
So yes, we even saw it in ManyClasses 1. So ManyClasses 1 had part of its sample, it was broader. Part of its sample came from IU Northwest, which has a much higher percentage of students who are Black. And in those classes, the participation rate was down near like 25%. So we see patterns that are evident also in other studies where students from historically marginalized populations are much less likely to participate in educational research. So yeah, no, it's worth saying that like some of those patterns extend to what we observe in ManyClasses. There's also other patterns that are more encouraging. So there are some places where, because the teacher expressed the importance of this study, we see consent rates that are up above 90%. So I think it's twofold. It depends on who the students are and their trust in research, and it also depends on how the classroom implementation is.
That's super helpful. I'm going to let other people weigh in, and then I have another question. There we go, Mark.
Hi, and thank you. That was a great talk. I very much enjoyed that. So terracotta is a very exciting thing. I think it certainly, as you say, builds some structure for which research can be conducted at large scales. I wonder if there's in terracotta, if there's some sort of training or recommendations, or something for all the choices that are entailed, all that, how do you determine what your sample is? How do you determine what the sample size is? How do you know if you need a between group or within group design? Or the analytical decisions. I think you kind of mentioned some base stuff there. So it seems like there's a lot more that goes into these sorts of projects. So are those sorts of ideas in terracotta?
You're scratching an itch, man. Yeah, so we think a lot about this. It turns out that experimental research is hard, and getting a teacher who might not be very well versed in education experimentation, especially considering that it's so infrequent, to set up an experiment is not easy. So in the ManyClasses studies, what we do is we generate a ton of documentation. It's basically like a guide for how to do everything and how to respond and what sorts of decisions you need to make. We're also working really hard on documentation for Terracotta. So if you go to Terracotta's website, I guess I could actually stop sharing and show it to you. Can you still see this? Maybe, yeah. So under resources, we now have a knowledge base that has a bunch of like details about what you'd want to know as a researcher about how to think about participation and stuff. And it's also worth saying that we have a quick start guide that basically walks you through the steps of setting up an experiment, a canned experiment. So imagine an experiment on mindset. So That's what we've got. And if you have any ideas to make it easier, then we would be interested to know. We designed Terracotta, not to spend too much time on it, but again, you're scratching an itch. We designed Terracotta to be basically modeled on the E2I coach. So the evidence to insight coach was an early Department of Education funded project that was a decision tree where researchers who wanted to do a study would walk through the decision process of how to create that study. But at the end, it would just tell you what the design was, and you'd have to go off and do it yourself. So Terracotta is like that, where there's kind of like a wizard that walks you through the design decisions. And then when it's done, instead of leaving you to go off and do it yourself, it's then implemented in the Canvas site. We do user research a lot, and we're really interested in knowing what makes it better. Yeah. It's a good question.
Okay, I'm curious about at the beginning you started with the story about the teacher who cries in their office after they get bad result, right? And in the beginning of that story, you're saying, it's a Herculean effort for them to get their IRB application approved or considered exempt or whatever. And I'm curious what sort of the higher okay, so like that's the smallest scale for an IRB, right? What is like the largest level of an IRB for education research studies that you've sort of seen be palatable, acceptable, approved? Like, what's the sort of biggest IRB blanket you have seen?
When we do it for many classes, we do it progressively. So we always start with a protocol that's just embedded in one class, and then we add classes with amendments to that IRB protocol. So it's the case that like we amend it to include a new data collection site or a new method of recruiting teachers. So scale is a progressive thing once we've gotten the core of the IRB figured out. And then it's just a matter of documenting that you've got the appropriate permissions from the teacher and that you're doing consent with the students so that we're not just going and stealing their data. In my experience, IRBs don't say no. They instead dictate the terms that you would need to do to get the project run. So yeah, our experiments have been relatively intrusive. I mean, we're experimentally manipulating curricular assignments. Like these are assignments that students have to do. So Terracotta has enabled us to check some of the boxes that IRB would be concerned about when you're doing that, including like, can a student opt out? And the answer is yes. There's a consent thing. If a student says no, then they don't get randomly assigned. They get whichever treatment the teacher says is default. If a student opts out, do you still collect their data? And the answer is no. The students' data are not included in exports. Are the students' identities safe? So yeah, the answer is yes. So we check off a lot of boxes as it relates to information security and privacy practices. And yeah, the consent decisions are hidden from the teacher. So I think that what's happened is we've navigated a bunch of the concerns that IRBs would normally have, and we've tried to create process solutions to them so that teachers don't need to reinvent those wheels and that the concerns of the IRB are kind of like automatically abstracted away. I don't know if that helps. It basically is the case that we've tried to anticipate all the possible concerns and give mechanisms for being able to deal with them.
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
I think I'm asking a variant of the same question that Mark and Becky have been asking, but when you think about those 3 years spent getting ManyClasses 1 off the ground and the pieces that go under that umbrella of research infrastructure that's so challenging, what are the things that schools and classrooms and IRBs get hung up on? What are the common blockers that people spend a bunch of time going around and around to sort out?
It's so data security is always one, and I think that that's not unexpected. That's just good stewardship of data. If you give a research team or give a technology solution a hard time about data security, then you're doing the right thing. So it's our hope that Terracotta, once integrated into school, helps to make it so that that's a one-time challenge and not every study type of challenge. Another issue that comes up is teachers are wily. I I don't know if there's a, that's the most accurate way of saying it. So teachers sometimes like to deviate from protocol, and that's caused in many classes too us to need to drop a couple teachers from the study because their experiment was tainted. So yeah, it's really important to have super strong documentation and close contact with teachers. The way that we did that was I invited her, but I don't know if she's here. Anna Keeney was the study coordinator, and Anna had basically like one-on-one meetings with every participating teacher, and they didn't just like meet to explain the study. They had to actually like see the implementation in Terracotta to feel comfortable that it was implemented appropriately. So you kind of also need like a primary point of contact who can be immediately responsive as soon as there's a problem. Because again, it's never quite clear that the teacher clicked on the right thing. So when orchestrating across classes, getting everybody on the same page is invariably going to be a challenge. And I don't know that there's any good solution to that, but yeah. The brass tacks of doing the study is, again, it's automated. So the crossover, like who's randomly assigned, what the participation method is, how informed consent is set up, that's all a non-issue. So it's more of a training process. Does that help?
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Can I answer another part of Becky's question too? So in terms of like, what's the biggest study that we could do? I also want to advocate that like, if you have a research question about a practice or about an intervention, and you honestly don't know whether it's beneficial, you probably shouldn't aim big. You should probably aim small. Because, and I mean that not in terms of scale. I'm a big fan of scale. Go big or go home. I mean it in terms of the incursion into the class. So if you honestly don't know if something's going to be beneficial, then it probably shouldn't be a big part of the course grade. It probably shouldn't be a huge portion of the student's experience of that course. So one of the things you can get with going to scale, like having lots of students and lots of classes participate, is you can get credible estimates of an effect, even if it's a relatively small effect. So I think that that's the right way of navigating it if you're going to scale. Yeah, that also appeases a lot of the concerns of IRBs.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was great. We'll look forward to many more Indiana and Michigan and other collaborations. So yeah, thank you very much. We appreciate your time and all your efforts to do all this work. As folks are heading out, Chelsea's got up the slide for the next talk, which will be by Claire Beck in early January. So after your next long break, come back and hear about Claire's study on student stress levels and how they have differentiated stressful from challenging courses. That's definitely going to be exciting too. But yeah, thanks to you all for spending some time with us this afternoon, and see you next time.
Thank you all. Thanks, Becky.
Thank you.